You're listening to Season 9 of Bionic Planet, Episode 110, entitled Ecological Economics, Systems Thinking, and the Limits to Growth.
The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. Goals for more growth should specify of what and for what.
Those are the words of economist Simon Kuznets, explaining why gross domestic product, or GDP, is a lousy way to measure a nation's health. Simon Kuznets is the man who invented GDP.
When proposing GDP as an indicator, Kuznets did not intend for it to be used in the way that we're using it now.
Jim Pittman is an ecological economist who's been working the climate puzzle for decades. He and I found ourselves on a long call a while back, phone to phone too, if you can believe it, reminiscing about the books that drew us into this field. Not the technical stuff, but popular books like Bill McKibben's The End of Nature, which dispelled the illusion of a limitless planet and explained the growing certainty on human-induced climate change in the late 1980s. It's the difference, McKibben wrote, between knowing that your 2 packs a day could very well give you cancer and hearing the doctor clear his throat and say, "I've got something to tell you." That book came out in 1989, 12 years after Freeman Dyson first floated the idea of using forests to slow climate change, and 10 years after the First World Climate Conference, where leading scientists from around the world unanimously declared that deforestation and changes in land use were 2 of the 3 leading sources of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. The United Nations created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, in 1988, and McKibben summarized in simple language the lines of evidence that even then were already converging on one conclusion, namely that human activities were changing the climate in dangerous ways that would eventually upend our civilization if we don't change our ways. Then came Fritjof Capra's The Web of Life, which echoed themes that Richard Dawkins and Alan Watts explored in The Selfish Gene and the book, showing that life is a network of self-organizing, self-regulating, and self-replicating systems nesting within other systems, interconnected and interdependent. Now, you can dismiss all of these as pop science or pop philosophy, but they were my gateway into systems thinking, chaos theory, and deep ecology, as well as climate and biodiversity finance. And it wasn't alone. These were the common canon of our day. Jim and I then pivoted to a 1972 book called The Limits to Growth, which offered a simple summary of early attempts to model the interactions between population growth, industrial activities, food production, and the Earth's living ecosystems. That book was a product of its time and of the computers of its time, with punch cards and models that were obsolete when I got to the book in the late 80s. But the logic was persuasive. If we continued with business as usual, we'd risk global ecosystem collapse by the year 2100. To change business as usual, the authors concluded, we needed to rethink the concept of economic health and well-being, shifting from the post-war growth model of GDP to something that included human and planetary health. It was a woolly concept, at least to me, at least back then, but the same authors updated the book in 2002. And 1 year later, 2 economists, Herman Daly and Joshua Farley, published a textbook called Ecological Economics, Principles and Applications. This is the one that, for me, crystallized all this other stuff, and it did so by explicitly framing our economy and our entire civilization as human systems nested in and completely dependent on natural systems.
It's a discussion about physics and chemistry. That's all it is. Those aren't negotiable. Those aren't political. They just are.
That's Matt Orsagh, another ecological economist who, along with Jim Pittman and Steve Rocco, who we'll meet in a minute, prompted me to download the updated version of The Limits to Growth, which came out 22 years ago in 2002. It seems I'm always 20 years behind on versions of this book. So, why had I taken so long to read the updated version of The Limits to Growth? Well, mostly because I stopped talking about the first version almost as soon as I started, back in the early 90s, after realizing that the title alone turned a lot of people off. Herman Daly used a different term, steady-state economics, to emphasize the need to grow the quality as opposed to the quantity of our economy within the limits of nature. But most of us, myself included, steered clear of discussing the issue of growth versus degrowth while gravitating to market mechanisms such as cap and trade, water quality trading, and mitigation banking, all of which started from the same premise, namely that we needed to live within planetary boundaries, and we could use markets to achieve that. Carbon and biodiversity markets were and are envisioned as a way of bringing our economy into our ecology by pushing a hidden scarcity into public view and crystallizing it. Unfortunately, the idea of using market mechanisms to meet ecological challenges triggered ideologues on the left, just as much as talk of limiting growth triggered ideologues on the right. And a lot of us, myself included, have at times tried to avoid triggering the likes of Greenpeace or the Cato Institute by steering clear of trigger words like environmental markets or degrowth. But Matt Orsagh says we need to do the opposite. We need to slap people with trigger words to wake them up. And the trigger word he's promoting is degrowth. Steve Rocco agrees.
Degrowth is just the end result there. It's not like we want that. It's just like you need it because you got to go on a diet. But it's just, it's just steady state economics that Jim was talking about. That's where you're headed. And the degrowth is just kind of like the diet. You're going to have to go on, then you're going to get to the steady state, and then it should work. But we don't know how to do that.
We've never done that.
It's a big experiment.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it, and nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields, and not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we address it through the eyes of three ecological economists, Jim Pittman, Matt Orsagh, and Steve Rocco, all of whom I hope will become regular guests in the future because our private conversations are exactly the kind of discussions that I'm hoping to mainstream through Bionic Planet. The genesis for today's show was my own realization that the foundational ideas that we're discussing in this episode aren't as widespread as I thought they were. And that's one reason for the dangerous disconnect between legitimate debate and public discourse. Today, we look primarily at the importance of systems thinking, the danger of tipping points, and the double-edged nature of the sword that is climate and biodiversity finance. If you like today's show, I can invite all three of these guys back for future episodes where we can dive into certain things that we only touched on here, such as what we can learn from slime molds and how financial markets can deliver a just transition if the degrowth paradigm takes hold. Two of today's guests, Matt Orsagh and Steve Rocco, are forming a think tank to explore exactly that. And if you like the show, you can help me deliver more and better episodes by hitting my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Bionic Planet, all one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support the show for as little as $1 per episode, but with a monthly cap. That address again is patreon.com, patreon.com/Bionic Planet.
Hi, I'm Matt Orsagh. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've spent about 25 years in finance in the sustainability ESG world, and now I'm focusing on degrowth.
My name is Steve Rocco, and I live an hour south of Geneva in France, near the mountains, and I've worked in finance and investment banking for a long time and have meandered my way after many painful failed projects to ecological economics and then degrowth as the kind of the pathway for building a future for our kids.
I'm Jim Pittman. I've been working in sustainability for about 30 years now, ecological economics for about 20. Most of my work right now is focused in finance mechanisms and innovation in green hydrogen, carbon, and biodiversity.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting how we all came together here. Jim, you and I met a few years back. I think we were both pulled in to contribute to the same paper. I dropped off. I don't know if you even finished it.
I did finish. Yeah, that was on carbon markets, challenging a lot of the assumptions and reframing the flaws in carbon markets. The title was "The Good is Never Perfect: Why the Current Flaws of Voluntary Carbon Markets Are Services, Not Barriers to Successful Climate Action."
Ironically, I dropped off because I was more of a hardliner on financial additionality back then than I am now. You guys were actually making arguments that I have since come to make, but it was before I'd read all the research on the decision-making processes that farmers use. And if I'd known then what I know now, I'd have put my name on it as well. Steve Rocco, you and I guess we tangentially worked on something about 10 years ago through Mission Markets and Forest Trends. I was not directly involved in that project, but you and I really met on LinkedIn, and it was an inauspicious beginning. You're really the one who sparked the sequence of events that led to this episode, but I say inauspicious because I misinterpreted something you said in a LinkedIn post where you basically told me I should go off and read a copy of this book, Ecological Economics, by Herman Daly and Josh Farley, and I thought you were being snarky because the book is part of the foundational canon of my career over the last 20 years. And I took what you were saying as kind of like, Jesus, you're an idiot. Go learn a few things before you start blabbing. I don't remember what sparked it, though. Do you remember the details of that conversation?
No, but it was probably something regarding the voluntary carbon market and my issue with the idea that it's voluntary. And like it or not like it, it's not it's not regulated in that way where you have to, and I think it was something like that.
I think I remember now. It was even more specific. You were saying the carbon markets were a way for wealthy companies in the North to take advantage of people in the South, and I disagreed.
Yeah, there's been some reporting done, and this is public, that a lot of large, and when I talk large, these are publicly listed companies, so huge companies buying carbon credits from very well-known consultancies and things like this. And people have gone in after to see what's happened, how does it work, and it's not as a happy ending story, while the company isn't changing its fundamental business model, right? It's not even the carbon credit part is working the way it's advertised, and it's still doing what it's doing, whatever that company's doing. So it's like a double loss to the humanity, something like that.
Yeah, I should point out, as people can probably tell, we did not reach agreement on this, but it sparked the discussion that led to this episode. I do want to just comment quickly, because I am outspoken on the voluntary market, and I'm leery of being taken out of context, because someone is going to take what you said and turn it into something I said. So just for clarity, I agree that it's not the happy ending that a lot of people have advertised, but I never advertised it as such. Neither did Mark Kenber, Mark Stewart, Sandra Brown, or any of the people who got this thing going. To me, there's no happy ending, but that's only because we're in the second act of a 3-act play, and the second act that's where all the complications are introduced. And the big problem I have is that most of the people dominating public discourse on the voluntary carbon markets, not you, but Greenpeace, The Guardian, they have skipped Act 1, which is where you're supposed to get the context. And that to me is a huge, huge, huge problem. And that's the same problem I worry about with degrowth, because context is everything. The context on the voluntary carbon market, which I covered a little bit in episode 100, is that it emerged to fill a very specific niche and to perform a very specific set of catalytic functions, overcoming inertia, encouraging action beyond what's required by law, testing new methodologies, generating data, generating papers like the one Jim and I were working on, and spawning little systems and systemic changes that would either die or evolve or be absorbed into larger systems. And I argue it's basically achieved all of that, and it was entering this period of adjustment at the end of an experimental pilot period. And it didn't get everything right, but it's being torpedoed by people who never did anything right or wrong. And in my opinion, not you again, but a lot of people are using the voluntary carbon market as a scapegoat for their own failures and the failures of all of us to do anything. But the point of today's show is one that Steve and I vociferously agree with, which is the tenets laid out in that textbook that he recommended to me, which I had on my shelf. And that's basically that our economy depends on our ecology, because everything we eat, breathe, and drink comes from nature. And that's kind of a standard spiel that I give. We're depleting nature faster than we can replenish it. And that brings us to the first sentence of the textbook, which starts, "What is economics?" And the answer is, economics is the study of the allocation of limited or scarce resources among alternative competing ends. That's the same definition all economists use. Even the free market fundamentalists use it. They come to different conclusions, in part because ecological economics starts with the premise that we're not living in a world of unlimited resources. We're living in a world of limited resources, and unrestrained capitalism is burning through those resources a lot faster than our planet can replenish them, which is what overshoot means. Hey, Steve, you're nodding there. Do you want to kind of chime in? Because you're the one who sparked this. Yeah,
you're right. That was the kind of the shocker, and it's a journey that I'm on, still on. That I went to university, then grad school, learn these economic ideas, right? And then go out, work on Wall Street and all this other fun stuff. And then there's all this kind of financing that we're doing now, green finance, innovation. You can go on and all these kind of mechanisms. And when you think about it, the finance is all built on these assumptions of economics. And we don't think about it. When you're sitting on a trading desk in New York, you're not thinking economics. You're thinking investments, markets, interest rates, whatever market you happen to be in. But underlying a lot of those ideas, almost fundamentally, is economics. And when you start looking at neoclassical economics or standard economics, if you went to any university, and then you open that book, which is what I did, I reread my books, and then you reread the ecological economics books, which I've mentioned to a lot of people now to just read it. You'll start seeing what I did. Why these things aren't solving the problems we're trying to solve. Why don't we seem to be able to bend the curve on carbon emissions or what inequality and et cetera, all the big problems we have. And when you start reading the ecological economics books and you start understanding how they believe in markets, but to a certain degree, they don't think markets do everything. And so then you're like, I had an aha moment. Kind of like, oh my God, no wonder this stuff doesn't work. It's really just that simple. And this led, I should mention, to this idea of getting a PhD in this topic. And I was on the way, found an advisor to do it, was on the way, and then I came across Matt. And that's when I realized, like, okay, getting a PhD is not going to help because my skill is probably just talking to people in the financial sector. And that's what the idea is for our...
Oh, so I'm the one to blame for your life decisions. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe you can tell us how you derailed him this way.
No, derail is not the word. It's just I realized that this kind of gets into a different topic, but that a PhD wasn't going to help. I can call professors and they can educate me. I translate it into something that a banker or a pension fund manager can understand. That's the whole idea of our endeavor with Matt.
And just to add, the neoclassical economics that Steve is talking about, that's in the textbooks that we learned, whether we're economists or part of an MBA or part of my CFA and all those things. It's about capital and labor for the most part, and it leaves out most everything else. And just throw that in a market and things will be cool. But it doesn't really think about the energy We put in the price of that energy and how you get that energy and the pollution from that energy and all those stuff that kind of really matters when you think about it. Herman Daly is one of the authors of that textbook. And so if people want to jump down that rabbit hole, he's the father of ecological economics. There's another guy I'll mention, Steve Keen. I believe he's Australian. If he's Kiwi, he'll be very angry at me, but I think he's Australian. That writes about this a lot. It talks about how the energy is left out of classical economics. So it's really a more fulsome look at economics, looking at economics isn't something over here separate from the biosphere. It's within it, just like all of us, and just like all economics depends on, and we'll get into this discussions later. Classical economics doesn't really get into very much the dependency and the codependency of all the systems that need to operate, and most of those are natural systems that we all depend on. They're just shoved off to the side in neoclassical economics.
That's the way I tried to figure out, well, how is this possible? It's because neoclassical economics stops basically with Keynes during World War II, approximately, plus minus. There's some other fun, fancy stuff that they did, Black-Scholes models and things like this after the war. But before that, you got to think where we were scientifically at that point and where we are today. It's not the same. We can put a man or a woman on the moon, et cetera, et cetera. So ecological economics just takes in all this science, and the neoclassical doesn't. But the expert here is really Jim. So I'd love to hear from him because he's really the most expert on the topic.
I appreciate the conversation. It's something that comes to mind for me in this respect is Herman Daly's empty world, full world model. And answering that question that you've mentioned, Steve, of how did economics go so wrong? Well, if we imagine a circle that represents the entire biosphere, the ultimate source or ultimate means from where all of our resources come from, economics hasn't done a very good job looking at how that system functions. And that's all well and good when the economy within that large circle is a relatively small square, say, floating in the middle of it. There's plenty of room between the two in what Daly calls the empty world model. There's plenty of room for error. We can be incorrect about the amount of scarcity of any given resource or the scarcity of the assimilative capacity of nature to reuptake our waste and turn it back into usable materials and goods. We're in a case now with the growth of human civilization where that square of the economy is very close to the edge of the circle of the biosphere. There isn't a lot of room for error in there. And so that's the ultimate need for the transformation of economics. I'm relieved to recognize that economics has done this type of transformation before, though, that we're at a very critical moment. There are a lot of issues that need radical transformative change in economics, but so too we were in the Great Depression. And that's when economics as a science created macroeconomics to complement microeconomics. So from that perspective, we're just at a point now where we need to design that next layer of complexity in the science to deal with that full world situation that we're in right now.
Yeah, very well said. And there's someone we haven't mentioned yet, but probably should, and that's Donella Meadows, who wrote one of the most accessible books on systems thinking that I've ever read, called Thinking in Systems. And she was also one of the driving forces behind a book that came out with a bang in 1972 and then disappeared, called The Limits to Growth. Now, I remember this book being passed around when I was in the environmental community in Chicago back in the early 90s, and everyone was like, oh man, it's a great book, but the title turns people off. So read it, but don't talk about the title. And I found that to be true. If I'd mention the book to certain people, they look at me like I had three heads, and I felt like the conversation just died. So I stopped using the title, but kept talking about the ideas, which were becoming pretty mainstream. Cap and Trade is essentially based on that. Then last week I decided I might as well get the audiobook because it is very well written, and it seems like the kind of writing style that lends itself to that. And I was surprised to find there wasn't one, at least not on Audible. I couldn't find an audiobook version. There's one that's supposed to be coming out in September, but there wasn't one yet, which really surprised me. But there is a podcast I found called Tipping Points, and it's by a woman whose name is Katie, I think is her name. She's either Scottish or Australian. I'm sorry, I should have the name at the tip of my tongue here, but I don't. It's a 3-podcast series, very well produced, called Tipping Point, The True Story of the Limits to Growth. And I highly recommend it. It's less than 3 hours of your time. And Jim, you're nodding there?
I highly recommend it. Yeah. Because it gets into that very point of why we stopped hearing about the limits to growth, the backlash, that people misunderstood it as being a prediction of specific outcomes as opposed to a projection of modeled outcomes with, imprecise timeframes. But continue on, Steve. Yeah, I think it was a great podcast to introduce.
Yeah, it was so good because she touched on the basic science and did it well enough that anybody who's coming in cold will get it. But what I found really enlightening was how she identified this structured backlash against the limits to growth, because I had responded to that backlash without even knowing that it had been orchestrated. She shows how Ron Bailey at Forbes and the Cato Institute, both of whom, by the way, I had a lot of fights with during my own brief tenure at Forbes, they were part of the Merchants of Doubt conspiracy or collusion or whatever you want to call it, and they got together to torpedo this idea of the limits to growth, using, by the way, the same tactics that Greenpeace and The Guardian are using to torpedo market mechanisms. I always found it ironic that in Naomi Oreskes' book, it was Greenpeace who did a lot of good work exposing the kind of sleazy communications tactics that Exxon and these guys were using to undermine trust in climate science. And they were effective because they know the tricks. And unfortunately, they use them as well. But what the podcast does is it does a good job of showing why we stopped talking about the limits to growth. Although I would say that we also thought the ideas were kind of creeping in without that term. I mean, cap and trade again. And even the voluntary carbon market are gateway activities that get people thinking along those lines. And in episode 100 of my podcast, Bionic Planet, Mark Kenber talks about how he got into the voluntary carbon market after trying to change the narrative from one of doom and gloom to one of opportunity. And that's something that's kind of been the tactic we've all tried to take. And it wasn't until after speaking to Steve, because in my mind, everybody in this space came from a systems thinking viewpoint, embraced the ideas of ecological economics, embraced the ideas of the limits to growth. But over the last 4 years, we've had so many people parachuting in who don't think that way. And it really dawned on me after speaking to Steve that these ideas aren't necessarily front and center. A lot of people coming into this space are only here because they smell money in it. And, we want those people to be here, but we also need to make sure that, we're not just pushing this idea of unlimited technological growth being able to get us out of this situation. And that's where Matt comes in, because Matt, what you said was, let's just stop dancing around the term and hit people with it, slap people with this term degrowth. And why do you think that's going to open minds rather than close them? I guess, why do you think it's a good idea to open with that argument, the degrowth argument, rather than leading up to it slowly?
Oh man, how much time do we have? As with anything, I think it's important to meet people where they are. And that's kind of what this degrowth think tank we're starting is, focusing on the financial world, because we're both from the financial world, and this is something that we're surprised that this conversation isn't farther along as it needs to be. I was born around when Limits to Growth was first written, and so it's been over 50 years since it came out. A woman named Gaia Harrington, she was at KPMG at the time, she wrote, I think it was 2020, 2021, next version of Limits to Growth. She came out with similar conclusions. Like, it's not predictive, it's a scenario analysis. But the analysis is that things are going to get really bad in the coming decades. And this is originally from 1971, 72 when it first came out, because of population growth and resource use and pollution, and all those things together over time add up to a pretty nasty cocktail. And I approach people, no matter whether it's finance people or people at my kid's soccer game, it's a discussion about physics and chemistry. That's all it is. Those aren't negotiable. Those aren't political. They just are. And we have to deal with them. And I know this is a podcast, so I don't want to give people visual homework. But a great visual, if people aren't familiar with it, is the planetary boundaries framework. The planetary boundaries are 9 different systems that keep us alive. that are natural systems that we need to keep in balance in order to survive and thrive on Earth. And we've pushed 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries past the danger zone, if you will, into the red, if you will, and we need to get them back. Climate change is just one of those. The other ones that we push past into the red are biosphere integrity, that's loss of animal and plant life, biogeochemical, this is phosphorus and nitrogen, an overabundance, mostly through fertilizer and agriculture, land system change, that's like deforestation, things like that, freshwater change, pollution of our freshwater, and novel entities, which is mostly plastics in our atmosphere. And there's a 7th one that's due to go past the red, and that's ocean acidification in the next couple decades, which will start anything with a shell in the ocean will start dissolving because the pH of the ocean is getting too acidic. And that's just chemistry. There's nothing negotiable, nothing spinnable about that. That's just chemistry. And so these things are happening. We're pushed into the reds in these planetary boundaries, and we need to address those. I don't care if you're left or right, or you're rich or poor, tall or short. It doesn't matter. It's just physics and chemistry. And I came across degrowth in just my research 4, 5, 6 years ago. And my first reaction to it was, oh, that's terrible. I don't want to have a depression on purpose, a Great Depression on purpose. But the definition of degrowth is an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level in the short or long term. Now, the challenge of that is you're pulling back on production, you're pulling back on consumption. People like their stuff, people like their wealth. That's going to hit that. There's no doubt about it. And that's a discussion we need to have. You can't negotiate about the physics and chemistry. I wish you could, but you can't. Those are set in stone. So we need to negotiate about what we're consuming, what we're producing, how we're polluting, and take care of those things. And that's where degrowth gets into the conversation. Scaling down in things that are harmful to us, scaling up things that are beneficial to us. That's a very oversimplified definition, and we can get into what that means.
Yeah, I'd love to. But I think we all agree that getting there is the hard part, and we need government to step up. And if we're going to have markets, we need regulatory drivers where markets are being used to allocate finite resources, as the book says. Jim, there's a couple of things that we've talked about in the past that maybe you could pick up here. One is something that Matt just touched on, which is that we're in overshoot. We have to pull back. But if we don't pull back from overshoot, we're going to be hitting all these tipping points where everything changes. And I think the New York Times just did a really good piece on tipping points, which is something I've not seen articulated very well in mainstream media before. In fact, one reason I left mainstream media back in 2005 or so was I couldn't get anybody to write about this stuff. Can you just quickly tell us the difference between overshoot and tipping points? What happens when we go through a tipping point? And then the other is something that your friend Josh Farley, who's also one of the authors on the Ecological Economics textbook, has been talking a lot about, and that's slime molds and how they behave when confronted with scarcity. I tend to see markets as a way of helping us behave more like slime molds. Can you take that word salad that I just made and sort of get something sensible out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so, Steve. I also want to highlight Matt's mention because I think there's a very important nugget there of the importance of looking at physics and chemistry. And if you look at those, not just the founders of ecological economics, but those thinkers who led the way there, in particular, Georgescu-Roegen was getting into the physics aspects of economics and why essentially conventional economics violates the laws of physics. Arguably, there are some issues from the chemistry standpoint as well. And I think it's important to look at this because whether you look at his work or John Gowdy or then Herman Daly and Costanza and others, that's the foundation that economics as a science is structured on flawed assumptions. They don't conform to the laws of physics. Physics is a science that is more binding than economics, shall we say, being a natural versus a social science. And so ultimately those rules will hold. That becomes very significant in the context of overshoot. But I think one of the things I'll highlight on the way to answering your question is that When we look at tipping points, that evokes more than just the concept of overshoot. Certainly when we think of overshoot, we think we're getting past a limit to growth. Past that limit, we're going to start to have problems. When we get into the notion of tipping points, we're talking not just about problems, problems accelerated with a positive feedback loop. So it's almost as though as soon as you recognize you're getting into the problem, it's too late to get out of it with a tipping point is the problem. You get into a phase state lock-in. And so that's the importance of, for example, the precautionary principle and anticipatory action and moving faster than we think we need to in these transitions. I think Josh highlighted it very well with slime molds in his point that we must be able to look towards the natural world for an example of how this happens with other species. And he had found various species of slime molds will actually switch their strategy from maximizing utility from an individual standpoint in resource allocation and resource utilization in the absence of a stressor or a limit to growth to shifting in the presence of a limit to growth to managing resources and optimizing utility based on a collective metric. And so the slime molds will actually switch from working in individual self-interest to collective self-interest in the presence of that resource scarcity. And so there's some degree to which that's the same pattern we need to embody. And I think you see it from a policy standpoint as well as from a private sector innovation standpoint. We're trying to figure out how we can restructure all of our organizations and all of our lives with that sense of a collective optimization strategy, which is not an easy process. That's a big learning process.
And I think a good point to a segue there is to that what Jim is talking about is going from the individual to the collective.
Exactly.
Right? In a way, that's the slime mold is doing this this kind of naturally switch on off. And if you think about it, neoclassical economics. So this is the way we have built this. Everything around you, everything we see, we eat, we do, is built on this idea. It's really built on the idea of the maximization of utility, right? And that homo economics, or there's some name like this, they're trying to maximize their needs and wants, if you will. And if you look at ecological economics, the three main principles are scale, and this is something Jim talked about, the planet and Daly's circle diagram, right? So that's number one. Number two is just distribution, not just distribution, but just. There's an issue of equality. Because if there's one apple and there's four of us, that's all we care about is being efficient. And you got to get into the weeds of the ecological economics to understand why the policy prescriptions that they're suggesting, because we got to go on a diet. Degrowth is just a diet for the economy. Think of it that way. It's just pretty simple. It's not so complicated. But if you don't have this idea of scale as an issue, as I need to think about that, and you have no thinking or you don't care about some sense of justice that we have to share, right? We're on a life raft and we got to share that apple. That's why we're getting these policies that don't work. And when you guys are saying we're getting close to overshoot, I think we're overshot already.
Yeah, and 6 of the 9 were already overshoot. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you can look at also the that other thing that comes out every year, the one that shows how many resources a country uses.
Earth Overshoot Day.
Yeah, Earth Overshoot Day from the Global Footprint Network using the ecological footprint methodology.
Yeah, or something like that. And we're in the red. So I think what's happened is we didn't take it seriously. And why? I've asked myself, why didn't we take it seriously? Because when Meadows wrote her book in the 70s, and that came out when I was this big, little, very little, it implied that people had to rethink how to distribute what we had. And people said, no. The rising tide lifts all boats. That's the underlying principle. The problem was the scale. The planet's just not big enough. If the planet was 5 times bigger, we wouldn't have any problem. But it's not, right? So there's all these reasons why Meadows was put into a box. And then I would add that the sustainable and green finance impact investing propelled these ideas. And I was part of it. I was an early impact investing, like, yeah, we got to do it. But at the end of the day, that stuff is not working because it's all built on the neoclassical economics with some flavoring around and a lot of nonsense, right? At the end, you need scale, just distribution, and efficient allocation in that order as your policy kind of a guidebook. And that's exactly what's in the textbook.
I can't say I completely agree with Steve on this, but I see his point. A lot of the ESG stuff is just flavoring, and baselines in forest carbon projects are tricky. But at the same time, some of the most pilloried interventions, specifically those in the voluntary carbon market space, have delivered tremendous results and lessons learned. And I'll reiterate that neither I nor anyone I know in the voluntary carbon market space sees voluntary actions as the answer. Voluntary actions are supposed to be part of a global mosaic of interlocking solutions operating under a lot of the premises that we're discussing today. And that mosaic has failed to materialize in part because public discourse has so dangerously diverged from legitimate debate. One thing hit me as I was editing this, and that's the different ways we all came into this space. I started out as kind of an artsy guy with a high math aptitude who stumbled into a job as a trader in Chicago with no real trust in neoclassical economics. The subject put me to sleep in college, and I wandered into trading by accident, then left as soon as I got bored. It wasn't until I read the textbook Ecological Economics 20 years later that standard economics really made sense. Today's guests, on the other hand, are bona fide economists. And Steve became disillusioned with standard economics just as I was coming to appreciate it, and partly through the same book. We're all on different learning journeys, and I hope that by sharing mine, I'm helping you with yours so that we can at least elevate public discourse and have reality-based discussions, disagreements, and agreements. If you think I'm doing a good job of bringing complex issues to a larger audience, and you want to see more and better episodes, then you can help me deliver them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet, Bionic Planet, no dots or dashes, all one word. There you can support the show for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. Getting back to the show, we were discussing Homo economicus and other more evolved forms of life.
I've talked to Jim, we talked about a month ago, and he told me this example, and I thought that's brilliant. All we need to know in life we learned from slime molds. But it's a great example of, around degrowth. A phrase you hear a lot is, degrowth is coming either by disaster or design. And if we just continue on the path we will hit those tipping points, whether it's the shutdown of the AMOC, the warming Atlantic current, that makes, you look on the globe, and Europe is about the same latitude as most of Canada, but it's much warmer. And that's because of the currents coming from the tropics, from the Caribbean. With melting ice sheets in the Arctic and Greenland, over time that will eventually shut down. And you'll have a mini ice age that will last for much more than any of us can see reversing. And the die-off of the Amazon, and there's dozens of tipping points. All of them are bad. And so that's the disaster. And degrowth gets to, let's design that. Let's design this. Let's not wait for that disaster. And one of the ways we got here, and it's interesting to go back and see how all this happened and all the history of the neoclassical economics, and this happened and these decisions were made. But one I want to touch on is we're all chasing in our lives, and our politicians are always chasing growth. And that's the book Limits to Growth gets to that. And that gets to growing GDP. Growing GDP is how we measure success as a country. You look at the back of The Economist magazine. I've been reading The Economist for 30 years. And the whole back inside cover is what's going on in GDP. This is how countries are succeeding or they're failing. I remember as a kid watching the nightly news with my parents. Every month I would see the GDP was up or down. And that's how we gauge, are we succeeding as a nation? And it's interesting, it was back in, I think it was right around World War II. There was an economist that was tasked with putting together a measure of how we measure how we're doing as a country. And his name was Kuznets. And he came up with GDP. But he specifically warned it shouldn't be used as an indicator of success. It's just one indicator of what's going on a moment in time. And he said you should strip out military expenditures because at the time, that was a big part of it, but that's fleeting. We shouldn't worry about that. And now here we are, all these years later, talking about GDP. We're in election year here in the United States. It's the biggest election year actually in the whole world, whether you think about all the people that are voting from India to Russia to the UK to here in America. And what does every politician promise? Growth. Because that's what we understand is success. And to some extent, yes. But when you live on a planet with limited resources, that's a problem. A great report on that topic is the Economics of Biodiversity, or the Dasgupta report that came out in 2021. It's about 600, 700 pages long, so take a week if you want to read it, but there is a shorter version. But it's about the economic limits to growth and the economics of biodiversity and the choices we need to make. But there's one piece of data that I remember the best from the report is that we're using Earth as though we had 1.6 Earths to use. That's the consumption and the rate of resource use we're using. And of course, as, what's his name, Stein, the economist Stein, actually Ben Stein's father back in the 80s, had the wonderful phrase, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And of course, it will stop. It's unsustainable. So that using 1.6 Earth's worth of resources is unsustainable. If you live in a developed market, that's more like 3 or 4 Earths we're using. And so degrowth is talking about, okay, let's slow down. How are we going to design this, whether it's our food systems or our transportation, the way we live, the way we interact with nature? So we pull back from the overshoot and we get to the point where we're designing this and we're not waiting for those tipping points because they're coming. The acidification of the ocean, the die-off of the Amazon, all those things are going to happen if we stay on this path. But we can get off this path, and it's not going to be easy. Our culture, our way of life is all around growing GDP, is around, I need to be part of the system because I've got to pay for my kids' college. I got to pay my mortgage. But there are ways we can rethink these things, and we can get into more detail on that later.
Jim is chomping at the bit. Jim?
I'm at the edge of my seat. What I most of all, let me frame it this way. I really appreciate Matt's reference of Kuznets because I think it's a little-known fact in economic history that the person who came up with...
I forgot his first name, Simon Kuznets.
Simon Kuznets. When proposing GDP as an indicator, Kuznets did not intend for it to be used in the way that we're using it now. And to some extent, right. I think the degrowth movement is very important. It's not the strategies that I would use right now for various reasons, but I do believe that those voices are important. I think the points that are being raised are important. I think the language and the urgency embodied in the language are very important. I think another strategy then, though, is to come with that sort of softer, simpler point of, hey, growth is questionable because the person who came up with the primary indicator we're using to measure growth did not intend it to be used in the way that we're using it. Just from an economic case, then you say, there is a problem here. And in that respect, GDP is measuring production and consumption of goods in the economy, but is that actually what we want to optimize? Do we actually really want to focus on optimizing health and well-being? And I think if the degrowth narrative was changed in that way to say, hey, shouldn't we use economic indicators the way that they were designed and not the way they weren't designed? And shouldn't we optimize the economy based on its ability to give us health and well-being? Most people would agree with those things. And then if you say that is not a growth-based paradigm, that's what we're talking about. I think it's a quicker way to consensus potentially. But then the question becomes, what indicators do we use? And well, there are 3 I like to cite. 2 I think are implementable internationally right now, immediately, would be the ISEW, the Index for Sustainable Economic Welfare, and the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator. There's certainly also option to use the Gross National Happiness, the GNH indicator that's used in Bhutan. But I think the first 2 are more easily implemented around the world and are being implemented by some jurisdictions and occasional countries. So I'll highlight in particular the Genuine Progress Indicator, just as Matt's mentioning. It removes things that aren't contributing to health and well-being from the economy, modifies the GDP. Things like accidents or warfare are removed, or environmental damage and spending to repair environmental damage are removed from the indicator of growth or well-being. And then things are added in that aren't well represented, like volunteer labor or all the labor in homemaking that is not quantified or included and is a huge value stream coming historically predominantly from women, although that is shifting over time. And so these things are valuable to our economy, they're valuable to our health and well-being, and some of the other things we're counting in GDP aren't. Shouldn't we tweak the indicator to actually make sure it's calibrated to what actually does and does not create health and well-being? That's what I'm most excited about. And I think the capstone is, just as Matt said, The person who created GDP as an indicator didn't think it should be used this way, so we shouldn't be using it this way.
What did he want it to be used for?
Just as a measurement of economic growth in the path to recovery after the World War.
Specifically after the war, right?
Once it was deemed that international nations reached stability again following the war, his thought was we would switch to a different model of assessing progress.
What's interesting, too, about Kuntz and GDP and
Kuntz or Kuznets?
Kuznets, the guy that did it or put it together, he worked for the U.S. government during the Depression and into the war. And that's what Jim said. But what's interesting is that what happens after the war, if you reread economic thinking before the First World War, and you go all the way to, Adam Smith, if you want, growth is not a big deal. No one really cares if we're growing or not growing. They don't really think about it, and let alone it being a policy objective, or what it is today, which is like the temple of growth. Please, let's grow as much as we can. If you go back and reread what happened, it's interesting. It's politics. It has nothing to do with economics. It's politics. The United States wins the war with the Europeans come behind the Americans. The OECD is created. NATO is created. Do you remember who we had as enemy at the time? It's the communists and the Soviet Union. It was a battle between capitalism and communism. And how did you measure and show who was the toughest guy on the block, if you will? Growth, GDP. Growth was the thing. And it's right after the war, and especially the OECD, that is start hammering this idea of growth. It makes it easy to compare the growth of Sweden versus Switzerland, or the US versus the Soviet Union, et cetera. And it becomes a totally political tool. And that's how we got ourselves to today, where you read Bloomberg, growth this, growth that. That's the good news in a way. And I'm not super Mr. Optimistic all the time. It's only in my mother's lifetime, so my mother's still alive, right? 85, but still alive, that growth becomes the thing we all want to survive. And it's really pretty new. That means we could probably undo that.
When the Berlin Wall came down, we kept chugging along in the same system.
And then we just kept coming along. And I think what happened there is by then capitalism, neoliberal, but capitalism as we have today, hyper big companies just took over. Neoliberalism takes over the whole political process. Thatcher, Reagan, you really can go right there to them and see how they basically just gut out all the services that governments can do. They hire consultants. This is not any of my ideas. It's just historically what happened. That's our lifetime now. And you can see the result has been of capitalism with no guardrails. We need guardrails. That's it. And then you got to keep these scale, just distribution, and efficient allocation as your kind of drivers. Put some rules. It can be done. It's not that it's mission impossible, but it requires people to make trade-offs. And this goes back to this, so.
Yeah, over and over again. Matt, now you look like you're itching to say something.
I was just going to say, Steve Zwick, I wanted to talk about language and degrowth and the language around degrowth that Jim mentioned, because I think it's important. But I can defer that to later at your show. If you had something teed up, I could do it now, or we can come back to it.
Sure, yeah, let's go where it flows. I do want to have all three of you back one day, hopefully more than once, but language is a big one. So, yeah, language.
Yeah, language. The word, I like degrowth because it's the word for the job, is the way I put it. And the people in degrowth will say it's a missile word, it's a confrontational word, and it's an uncorruptible word, is why I like it and use it. And what do I mean by that uncorruptible word? Well, think about the word sustainability. If something's sustainable. I'm in the finance world and in the ESG sustainability world. And when that first started coming around when PRI was created, the Principles of Responsible Investment, and ESG started to be used. That's about 2005, 2006. And then, what is this thing? ESG is terrible. Okay, I don't understand what it is. Let me learn about it. And now you have ESG funds. You have sustainability funds. You have products that are promoted, marketed as sustainable when they're really not. So, there's a lot of greenwashing around from companies and from investment firms, to the point where Europe and the SEC are starting to crack down on this. Years after that horse is out of the barn, it's in the next county already. And so I like degrowth because what company is going to promote their products as degrowth? What investment firm is going to promote their funds as degrowth? They ain't, is the answer. So I like that it's uncorruptible in that way.
The French guy that came up with
Yeah.
the word décroissance, because it's French originally, he knew,
It was brilliant.
and it's find it incredible. He knew that it was not co-optable. And that's why he said it that way. And I can't remember exactly when he wrote it, but I think it's like pretty old, the word. And he did it on purpose because that, like I'm saying, sustainability now, sure, whatever. You want it sustainable, I can make it for you. It's not true. I have sold this stuff like as a job. And it just doesn't work. So this where it gets complicated. And I'm going to take some of Matt's thunder here, but you got to think of the North and the South. In the North, you're not going to finance your way out of this problem. There's stuff that you're going to have to finance, that's for sure. But this gets into the strategy of degrowth, right? And there's stuff in the South that needs funding as well. But we throw it all together in a big soup. We need to get more sophisticated and more detailed and so forth and so on. Maybe I'll leave it there.
And that being said, I like degrowth as a missile word, as a non-co-optable word. That said, as I said in the beginning of this conversation, you got to meet people where they are. And Jim mentioned well-being economy. The principles behind it and the issues underneath it and the policies underneath them are all very similar. They rhyme. A post-growth world where we're not focusing on growth, or a good one is a-growth, or not. You're agnostic to growth. You're just trying to do the right thing by a well-being economy. And if there's growth, fine. If there's not growth, fine. But growth isn't the driver. One of the reasons Steve and I are starting this think tank, and we think we're on the right path, is we're seeing these discussions more and more in the real world. E&Y came out with their economic outlook for this year, and the report was mostly about
E&Y?
Ernst & Young. But
It
it's
is
E&Y,
okay.
E&Y Consulting. I think it's their economic outlook, but Google E&Y post-growth
Right. I heard
degrowth, you'll find it.
E&Y. Okay.
It's EY. So this big, huge consulting firm around the world, one of the big four, their team wrote a paper about degrowth or well-being economy and how we need to move there. And they mentioned the word degrowth, they mentioned post-growth, but it wasn't a degrowth, I'm making air quotes, paper. The New York Times op-ed wrote a piece on degrowth. I talked to the gentleman, Chris Marquis, last week, who wrote about, do we need to move to a degrowth world, on the Harvard Business Review. That wasn't the discussion 5 years ago. And so what we're trying to do is normalize this conversation around degrowth. If you don't like the word degrowth, that's fine. I understand why you don't like the degrowth. But the principles, we need to start with physics and chemistry and work back to what fits into that world. You want to talk about well-being economy, that's fine. You want to talk about post-growth economy, that's fine. But the principles are around what we need to get to, and that's based on the physics and chemistry. And degrowth is a confrontational word, I understand, and I think it's the right word for the job. But once you get past that, you're like, okay, what are the policies? Is it a 4-day work week or universal basic income, or subsidies for things we need and not things we don't need, and food policy like beef and dairy production? Eat all the meat and milk you want, but there are big environmental consequences to that. So let's talk about that. No one's taking away anybody's hamburgers, but we should be talking about that. We should be managing that because that can have a huge impact. But that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I'd like to loop back. I'd like to hear more about the think tank you guys are starting up in a bit. I'm wondering if first I could ask Jim, because you've been teaching this stuff, so you're like in the trenches in a sense, although there's a bit of self-selection because the students who come to you have already chosen this path. But what are you finding are the most difficult elements to convey to people, and how do you get that across?
Great question, Steve.
Yeah. Or is that like too big of a question? Is that a whole
No,
episode?
it's a really good question, and I'll add a little piece in that also comes from this previous discussion here. But so yeah, I taught for 10 years in the world's first sustainable business MBA program, and then in various other programs. I think probably 20 years of teaching overall, and it's not a huge part of my work now, except in the private sector, doing teaching within the context of consulting and things like that. And I think the biggest thing that I see that people don't get in these contexts is it's not going to be easy. When we see the co-opting of the sustainability word, we were talking about this in the 90s, about how it was already being co-opted as a word. I had started a an Institute for Regenerative Ecological Design. And we were then saying, how long is it before the word regenerative gets co-opted on the heels of sustainability? And I think it lasted about 20 years, but it's fully being co-opted as well. And the most important thing that I think of that folks is counterintuitive and students and others aren't getting is it's not easy. It's not simple. Nobody has all the answers. Regardless of how much of an expert they are in sustainability, present company included, none of us have all of the answers because the answers are defined in context. We can have design principles for sustainability, but sustainability is defined just by nature of the word. It's defined over time. So there's no such thing as reaching a state of being sustainable, because that's a matter of if that trend or pattern of way of being can continue within the systemic context it's in indefinitely into the future. So it's a tricky thing. That's the biggest thing I think folks don't get. The other thing that I don't think folks get is sustainability is part and parcel an element within conventional economics. You can actually draw the justification for it from conventional economics. The bottom line is business as usual is not economically efficient. From the perspective of Pareto efficiency and Pareto optimality, which is integral to conventional economics, we are in the process of making some people better off by making other people, and more than human people, worse off. That is not economically efficient, even in conventional economics. Plain and simple. Greenwashing, then, to claim that I'm sustainable when I'm measurably not, is not only a problem because I'm misstating my progress and I think I'm achieving some outcome that I'm not actually achieving, but it's masking the fact that those negative impacts to other people and to the environment as a result of my economic activity are not being assessed, are not being included in the economic equations. That's moral hazard. I'm incentivizing behavior by which I and my company can be made better off while others and the environment are made worse off. So I'm violating Pareto's laws of efficiency, and I'm creating conditions of moral hazard.
I don't remember what Pareto's laws of efficiency are.
Pareto efficiency essentially says you shouldn't make some people better off while making others worse off. That's economically inefficient. And so if I'm using sweatshop labor, or if I'm exhausting a resource that is essential for subsistence living for a local community, or is creating pollution that's causing health problems for people, that's just simply not economically efficient within the context of conventional neoclassical economics. So that's why I say, let's go back to conventional economics to justify sustainability and say, okay, well, these impacts, or what we call externalities, have a cost, have a burden, have negative ramifications. It's just I'm not experiencing it. And so to cap it off, the solution, we should understand the impacts of our business activities. We should understand the impacts of our economic choices. That's what's known as complete information, an essential set of information to ensure conditions of perfect competition that ensure economic efficiency in conventional economics. So in many ways, sustainability is just the next logical evolution from a conventional neoclassical economic model even. I don't know if that answered your question, though.
Well, it does, because it goes back to, again, my own segue into this. And I remember, I think it was Josh Voorhees or Michael Jenkins, one of the two, used to always say that if we put the cost of environmental degradation into the cost of production, we'd solve this whole mess. And that was the great theory. Obviously, it's not that simple, but it is that simple in a way, because some things would cost a fortune. Yeah, most probably. And
I've actually seen some research to show that if you actually internalize these externalities, most, if not all, Fortune 500 kind of companies at that scale, that size of companies don't work. They're not economically, they don't make a money. I've seen research like that. And that's like, what? And that leads to another thing that always throws a wrench, and something I think about and tell people about. It's like all the prices that we have experienced in our lifetime are wrong because they don't include these things. So if you kind of think like that, when you bought your first toothbrush to the car you buy, the prices are not really accurate. So if prices are wrong, revenues are wrong. If revenues are wrong, rates of return on every investment are wrong. It's a mind-blowing idea, and I've had some people really get very upset with me and yell at me about it because you realize it. You're like, wait, if we didn't include these things, then it's just a simple, it goes from the price of a pencil to the stock price. There's a link there.
One added complexity now, of course, that is counterintuitive for those folks who are a little bit aware of some of these issues is that it's not actually possible to do that. And so this gets at the difference between environmental economics and ecological. I think the report you guys are mentioning is Natural Capital at Risk, which says that few, if any, of our companies would be profitable if you calculated all the externalities in. And environmental economics says that. Just quantify these impacts, put them into the equations, and then you'll see what equilibrium really is. In ecological economics, we go a little further to say it's actually not possible to translate all these things into numbers and to quantify health and well-being of humans and environmental systems. And the cost and time required to do so would just be prohibitive. And so the notion is that from a precautionary principle standpoint, we need to recognize these things are true and move forward with the first principles approach, because we never will be able to fully quantify all externalities and put it into the price. A lot of folks think we can just quantify it, add it all up. But having been working in that quantification world now for 20 years and being at the forefront of it, I'll say it's literally not possible in a comprehensive way.
I used to tell people, I remember saying, we just need to internalize the externalities. It doesn't work. It just, and this goes to another kind of key point, I think, is that the idea of markets. What do markets work for and what do they not work for? That's like one of the fundamental things that really rocked my thinking. And you can have a discussion with an ecological economist and he says, yes, markets work. We know they work, but they have a limit, not in a limit like a line, but there's in areas they don't work. And when it comes to simple things like pencils and my wages as a bus driver, they work. Markets work. So you don't have to fix anything. They work. When you get to a lot of other things, they just don't work. And it goes to the complexity. And this is like the science behind ecological economics. It's so much more complicated because the system we're in is more complicated. Adam Smith didn't know what Jim Hansen from NASA or wherever he is now knows. That's the fundamental thing today. It's like markets work over here. We don't have to fudge with them. Maybe you have to make sure people follow the rules and regulations, etc. They don't work over here. And some of the big systematic problems, and this is my big issue with the carbon credits. It's not going to get to the outcome you're looking for. So you keep trying, but there's a reason it's not working. And I used to think it was just that people weren't trying hard enough, or maybe people were fudging or cheating. It's not that. It's just economics. They don't work. And so you need a different set of solutions. And degrowth is just the end result there. It's not like we want that. It's just like you need it because you got to go on a diet. But it's just, it's just steady state economics that Jim was talking about. That's where you're headed. And the degrowth is just kind of like the diet. You're going to have to go on, then you're going to get to the steady state, and then it should work. But we don't know how to do that.
We've never done that.
It's a big experiment. And the politics, because of the second point, that just distribution. Just. How do I define just? Who gets what? If I got one pencil, who gets to use it first? Does Jim use it first? Do I use it first? And so forth and so on. It's all about democracy then. So you quickly get into this. It's fascinating, but very challenging.
A quick insert, a real good example of where we've already realized those things in a smaller way and we do it in a way that is more innovative is, I hate to say it, but triage in the hospital. When you get a disaster and there are too many people coming into the hospital for the hospital to handle, they switch to a triage decision making. And instead of serving everyone, they evaluate who's they're going to serve in terms of the severity of the issue the person's experiencing and then the amount of resources to solve it. And they make the unfortunate decision that some people are not going to be savable. We're in a global triage now where, I hate to say it, but our luxury lifestyles are not going to be savable. We need to look at how we're going to get by as human beings on this planet rather than some of us having extreme luxury due to economic inefficiency and market failures.
And to give some hope here, because really at the end you're going to go, we're doomed. What are we going to do? We're doomed. I don't think so. And I'm, again, not the optimist, but one story that I think we're going to integrate into Matt and I's pitch, if you will, when we go out and start talking to people, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And you're like, what does that have to do with it? Well, there was a war going on in Europe. Americans don't want to go. He realizes we have to go. What did he do? He knew he had to rearm the United States because the United States didn't have an army after the Depression. And he went out and put in purchase orders with Ford, Caterpillar, Boeing, et cetera, all the companies we know today, and said, hey, guys, can you build me the tanks? Can you build me the ships? And then, okay, what do you think happened? They delivered. No. What happened was the CEOs, since they were caught between thinking about their current businesses and fighting the Germans, they were waffling in the middle, and they couldn't do it. They didn't deliver. What does FDR do? He took over the American economy. Let's be very clear what he did, He just said, that's it, game over, no more private enterprise. We have a board of war board. There's all these names and a lot of institutions that were built, and they took over the American economy. What? Yeah. And the reason why, because the private sector could not deliver the bombs, the tanks to do it. Now, replace the Nazis with climate change. There you go. That's what that's, I think, the best. And this one is my idea, because I saw this kind of linkage, and you're going to need some massive planning at the state level to make it fair and not voluntary. Another one of my big pet peeves. It cannot be voluntary. No one will do it if it's not fair. It's got to be fair. And just distribution and fair, that sounds approximately the same idea, right? So I think there's a way to do this, tricky.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, again, not for you, but for listeners, so they know that I don't know anyone in voluntary carbon markets who really thinks voluntary action alone will get us there. Everybody sees it as something incremental, something transitional, something that gets the ball rolling. And we all agree on the need for governments to step up. But the takeover that you're describing sounds unsellable too. And it reminds me of Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, where he argued that a wartime economy is different from a peacetime economy. And you could make a case that the backlash against FDR is what led to Reagan and Thatcher. So this,
What he did was he took over, they win the war, everything got disassembled, and the private sector went back to being in the driver's seat.
Exactly.
And then we had the kind of neoliberal takeover in the 80s, and now we have out of control capitalism just burning through the planet. Okay, let's find an FDR, put him in charge, and let's just redo that.
We're running out of time. We're actually over time right now. And so maybe a couple of quick things before we wrap up. One is we've all talked about books we've read that have influenced us and have brought us to this place that we're at now. And I'm wondering if we could do a quick round robin to describe the most accessible books on systems thinking and degrowth. And then we'll come back to the issue of the think tank that you guys are putting together. Jim?
Great. Thanks, Steve. I go back to Donella Meadows as well, because she was one of the biggest heroines in my early days getting oriented to all this. And what I've appreciated from her over time is the way to which Donella was able to span both the sort of emotional, interpersonal realms of these dynamics and then the technical realm. She would write about complex system dynamics, and then she would also write about the role of compassion in helping with this transition, and she would go back and forth in between. So I just think she's just a tremendous thought leader that we lost far too early in that respect. The book that I would recommend in that respect, that I think was compiled and published after her death, was Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella. There's also a really easily accessible and small book that just came to mind by Alan Atkinson. He, of course, wrote the Believing Cassandra book in the 90s, but a more recent one from him was Sustainability is for Everyone. And so Thinking in Systems and Sustainability for Everyone, to me, are really great intros that are in language that anyone can understand, that take you to advanced understanding of these complexity dynamics. Of course, then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention and reiterate the Fritjof Capra. I think my intro to systems thinking before I got into Senge and some of the folks from MIT was Fritjof Capra's Web of Life, that I had more bookmarks than the book could handle. But then his hidden connections and systems view of life are also very powerful.
And do you want to take a stab at summarizing what we mean by systems view? Or should we just say read the books? That might be the best way to go, because I can't think of how I would summarize it in 30 seconds.
The way I tend to summarize it is that as human beings, we tend to have a very linear causal understanding of things that happen. If something happens, if there is an effect, we look for a single cause. And for every cause, we look for a single effect. And the notion that there's one cause and one effect is actually not remotely how the world works. There are a vast number of very complex causes and effects to everything. Say the butterfly effect, that a butterfly flapping its wings around the world can cause a hurricane or a tsunami on the other side of the world. And it's the complexity of these causal relationships that actually results in the things that we see in our world. And systems thinking is a constant process of stretching the human mind to comprehend things that are far more complex than we understand in a rational, linear way by nature.
Systems thinking, a friend of mine has this great phrase that she uses when there's a big, hairy problem in front of you, is stepping back and admiring the problem.
I like that.
And that's a lot of what systems thinking is. And systems thinking, I think, is also, it's a good lesson in humility, because you're not going to come up with a number. You're not going to come up with an answer. A great way to think about it is if you're familiar with the three-body problem in physics. And the way I understand it is for the motion of planets or huge objects in space, if you have two objects, it's pretty easy to understand how they're going to interact with each other and the gravity and everything. But you add a third object, it becomes impossible. You can get close to what it might be, but it becomes impossible to be precise. And so think about adding a fourth object and a fifth. And think of all the systems that we live in, we have. Go back to the planetary boundaries I talked about. Those are huge systems, the climate system, the land system, the water system. You're not going to come up with an answer of, if I do this and this, what's going to happen? You don't know. But to understand that you have to try to understand how this world works. And that's antithetical to a lot of the way we think. We're all in jobs and parts of our lives where we get paid to think of one thing. Think of the human body and all the different specialties for doctors. You have a lung specialist, a heart specialist, a brain specialist, a kidney specialist, a foot specialist, and so on. But they have to know how all these systems interact, because if you're a heart specialist, you have to know what problems could be leading to this heart problem that are lung related or brain related or whatever it is. That's a good analogy, is the human body of all these huge systems. And you have to step back, admire the problem, and try to understand it and understand as much as you can. And not just say, well, I'm a heart specialist. A heart is the cause of everything, because that's just, that won't work. I've read Donella Meadows, It's Hard to Beat. But I'll answer the question I wished I was asked, like a good politician. And I will recommend Jason Hickel's Less is More. It's a great intro to degrowth. And another great resource is just look up, if people want, the degrowth database. It's exactly what it is. And it's this great resource of all things degrowth. And jump in and jump down that rabbit hole if you wish.
I think we got that systems part. I don't know a lot to add there. One book I think that is great for everyone is The Donut Economics, because it really is ecological economics. It's nice and simple. The woman has found a way to make it easy and understandable, and she made some choices in how she's speaking. I've heard her speak about how she even got to the name of the donut, which she doesn't like, but it's just what people stuck with. So that's one. That's an easy one to read. I think that I usually go, just read that one.
Kate Raworth is the author.
And then just to segue into the think tank, my academic advisor recommended a woman by the name of Carlota Perez. And she's a Venezuelan researcher, nothing about degrowth. She actually doesn't believe in degrowth, but she wrote a book called Technical Revolutions in Financial Capital. And this is all about growth. She's a historian on growth. And reading her book, she came up with a theory, and it's really what I studied when I was at Berkeley. I realized after. What she came up with was this idea of these three pieces that work together, and that's how our economy has grown from Adam Smith to today. You have the technology itself, so it could have been a pencil to software. You have the government and society running behind the tech to manage it and see how to use it, and then you have capital. Financial capital, banks, money, investors. And that's how I got on this track of thinking about the degrowth and ecological economics within the context of the financial sector, which is where I come from. And that's how my PhD was going to be a post-growth financial sector. What would that look like? That was going to be the topic of the thesis of the PhD. And then with Matt, where it just makes more sense for us to just go talk about it. And that's, I think, one of the foundations of our thinking on why should we go talk to the banks? If you want to slow down growing, you got to talk to the money, period.
I didn't realize that was going to be the subject of your PhD.
Yeah, it's going to be that.
That, as you know, is what we were looking at Forest Trends all last 20 years. I'd love to dig deeper into that in the future. I also wanted to reiterate what Jim said about Freithof Capra's book, The Web of Life. I found it to be an absolutely brilliant read. And I know it's classified as pop science, but it was incredible. It's all about living systems. He does a great summary of all the literature up to the time. And what he really does well is he explains phase shifts and tipping points and, states of stability. He explains that better than anyone I've ever seen. And it also pairs well with Donella Meadows' book because he's coming from the bottom up. He's starting with the origins of life and working up into systems and how they've emerged and evolved. And she's just telling us what systems are with a very top-down view, and they meet right in the middle. Another one I would just throw in the mix is another pop science book. It's called Energy and Civilization by a guy named Vaclav Smil, S-M-I-L. And I picked that one up thinking it was going to be a textbook on energy, and it was not. It's kind of like it's actually kind of like Capra's book. It's a history of energy, going back to energy coming from the sun, coming to Earth, early animals, food energy. It's just absolutely brilliant. And he also makes it very clear how limited the amount of energy is that we have access to and the challenges of moving beyond that. And it does lead into the issue of degrowth. Maybe now we can go to this think tank that Matt and Steve are creating.
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, our mission statement is, it may change a little bit, but it's basically to normalize this conversation in the financial world because it's not really happening enough. There's some places they're starting to do it. There's Triodos Bank in the Netherlands. The chief economist there, Hans Stegman, writes about this openly. It's part of his job. Jefferies Bank, Henrik Shaw there at Jefferies Banking in the U.S. has talked about this stuff, but that's few and far between. And getting back to these are physics and chemistry limits, and the financial world doesn't really respect those, and we need to. And so it's normalizing that conversation. And again, we can call it degrowth, we can call it well-being economy, but we need to start having those conversations around those tables. And that's our goal, to do research and write and speak to those folks to normalize this conversation.
And one more thing that goes back to the book that I was talking about here from Carlota Perez. She writes that when the telephone was invented, guess who was the first kind of client of the telephone? Bankers, because the bankers were the first ones. And so what we're hoping is maybe there's somehow that we can stimulate a conversation with bankers, pension fund managers, you name it. Once they realize that their money is going to go up in smoke, literally, what could they do if they're motivated and they have a space to discuss openly without fear of their jobs or whatever? What can we do with that group of people? And so that telephone analogy is interesting because finance people don't do anything really. We don't make stuff. We just move paper around. We tend to be the first movers because we're like, okay, where the engineer has to actually think about how the telephone works and how do we plug it in. The bankers, okay, sure, let's do it. Maybe that's a better use of our efforts, is to get these people to think and come up with some more motivation or something to move us in this direction. I don't know, money, funding for something that is not getting funded. Who knows?
Interesting. Do either of you guys know Patrick Young? He's a friend of mine. He wrote a book called Capital Market Revolution in 1998 about the future of capital markets. And, the gist was it's going to go in two different directions. One, just exactly what you talked about, how communications were going to change everything, how the internet and new communication systems were going to completely overhaul the way markets were structured. And people thought they knew how that was going to happen, but they didn't really back then. And it's interesting. He just had the 25th anniversary of the book, and the New York Stock Exchange invited him to ring the closing bell. And the irony being that the New York Stock Exchange is now owned by the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, which didn't even exist when the book came out, but became everything that the book predicted. That book is also being reissued, and it's also a very fun read. You know, a lot of people can write, but they don't really know what they're writing about, and they can be pretty dangerous. A lot of people understand stuff and can't seem to write it, and they can just be frustrating. But everybody we've talked about today is not only a great thinker, but an accurate thinker, a precise thinker, and a very clear and entertaining writer. Maybe now we can also talk about some other issues that you guys would like to come on the show to discuss, because I'd love to have you guys back. I think you guys are all very good at articulating some pretty complex issues. And maybe I can ask you what subjects you think we should touch on in future episodes of the Steve, Jim, and Matt show. Jim, you want to start with that one?
Sure, I'd love to do that. The biggest thing that we're circling around in this conversation, I think, is part and parcel of what's really happening in the broader world. Is we sort of have these thoughts of it's one way or the other, capitalism or communism, or it's going to be a mandatory compliance system to solve climate change, or a voluntary system, or mandatory and voluntary bolted together, or market mechanism or tax mechanism. And I think the thing I'd like to close with is the notion that ultimately the solutions that are going to get us out of the current situation on a better track are things that we have not seen before. We're not going to recycle a solution that we already have, that already exists somewhere. We're talking about a design realm where we need to take aspects of capitalism, aspects of communism that might have worked better but didn't, or aspects of mandatory and voluntary, aspects of market and tax, and design something that is new and is really addresses the current situation in human civilization.
Yeah, from this conversation, I would say two. One of them very scary and one of them very hopeful. The scary one is, I think it's a very interesting talk about tipping points that Jim mentioned. There's many of them, and I think they're not well understood because inertia is such a powerful force. We assume the world is going to be as it was yesterday. But these tipping points are coming and will put us in a very different world. And so a respectful fear for what may be coming, so spur action. And then secondly, a deeper dive on what a post-growth or ag-growth or degrowth well-being economy looks like. Because we just touched on it, but the promise is that it's better than what we have and it's more sustainable than what we have. It's called a well-being economy for a reason. It focuses on well-being. And I think that a deeper dive into that, Kate Raworth would be a better guest than us. But that kind of discussion, I think, would be instructive to people. Because we touched on a little bit now, but I think people may be leaving asking, okay, what does that mean? So a deeper dive on that.
If it's up to me, I keep thinking in 3 months from now, 2 months from now, I'll be on the phone with a pension fund manager somewhere, and he's going to be yelling and screaming about markets and this and that. And at the end of the day, it's all about the economics underneath. And you got to compare and contrast. That stupid stuff we used to do when we were little kids, compare and contrast these two models. And that requires, it's like 16 textbooks to do. How else are you going to convince a person that has a job making X amount of money, managing lots of money? I mean, their egos are very large and totally embedded and enmeshed in their jobs in this economic system. So you got to get into those kind of details to convince someone like that to go look. But I think they're going to have that aha moment. But to your point, it's really just how do you compare and contrast to really convince people that the ecological economics, we got to get on the bandwagon like now. Like we're running out of time. And the other point is what Jim was saying is that my academic advisor, his name is Mario, I asked him, what are we going to do? How are we going to solve? How are we going to survive? He goes, we need to experiment. And that's exactly what I think what Jim was saying. It's all experiment. I would say we have most of the tools, the technical abilities here. We don't need to go, there's not a lot of stuff we're missing. It's the combinations and contortions that, like what Jim was saying and what Mario was saying, experiment that we have to do. But you got to have a space to do that and the willingness.
Yeah, I mean, experimentation is great, but I'm going to refer you again to the voluntary carbon market as a cautionary tale because, and I hate to keep returning to it, but the fact is that voluntary carbon market was created as a big experiment, and now it's being blown apart for not having solved every problem on the planet. And if you're going to experiment, be prepared to be ripped apart by people who do nothing or who are ideologically opposed to whatever it is you're trying to experiment with. Anybody want to throw anything else out there before we wrap up? Because we are over.
No, I would just invite people to, we all met through LinkedIn and social media and each other. I would invite people to reach out to us after hearing this if they want to learn more. I have a Substack on degrowth I write that you can, I'm the only Matt Orsagh in the world, so I'm easy to find. But to reach out to us if you want to normalize this conversation further.
Matt Orsagh closing out this edition of Bionic Planet. For links on how to contact all of us, you can check out the show notes or visit bionic-planet.com. Look for episode 110. There you can also find a list of all the books we've discussed today, as well as a link to my Patreon page, which is critical because, we're talking about degrowth, but I can't afford to work for free. If you think I'm performing a service here, then you can help me produce more and better episodes by going to patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Bionic Planet, all one word, no dots or dashes. Once again, that's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. And that's all for today. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.